Mr. Harwood. He has also expertise in economic analysis and has 25 years of experience working in the financial sector and as management consultant. He also currently lectures on the finance executive program in the University of Wales, and also has the open presidency of the International Affairs and Economics and Development. He has also secured the students of the welcome to Mr. Harwood to talk about economic growth in Islam.
Fellow presenters, and of course the public, which has agreed so kindly to give up their Saturdays to come and talk about the subject. On the plane over yesterday, I was reading in the Financial Times, the deputy editor, Gillian Tatt, she raised, in an article, a fantastic point, and she said, what on earth can anyone do to get loans flowing to small businesses? That's a question many politicians and financiers have asked in recent months. And I thought, what a fantastic summary of why we're here today, and exactly the problem that we are seeing in financial markets. What she was referring to was that there's $1.7 trillion of money that American companies have failed to repatriate back to the United States. Why? Because there's arcane taxation laws which are... I've got it up here. We're going to be in stereo here, but never mind. Just to cause more confusion. So we have these arcane laws which are acting as an obstacle to people bringing their capital back into the US, and as a result of that, there's no money available for loans, and finance and small business in particular, which is seen as the growth of the markets, is suffering. So today I want to talk a little bit about an Islamic alternative, and I will just raise a caveat that this is, unfortunately, it's not actually functioning today. Yes, we do see, as Professor Nienhuis mentioned earlier, we do see aspects of Sharia law, we see aspects of Islamic finance in some corners of the world, but we're not seeing the whole package. So I'm going to talk a little bit in a theoretical manner. My first part of the presentation is not theoretical, it's about the actual reality today in our markets. But the second part is dealing with how Islam deals with this. And I'm talking about the classical caliphate Islamic system, which includes not only ruling social system, but also many very important economic principles. So we look at our current context. We can see that we have major financial crisis of hitting us 4 or 5 years ago, and we have a stock market boom. We saw the bubble of the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s. We are currently in maybe the biggest bond bubble of all times. For the last 30 years, the bond markets have been going up, but the interest rates cannot go any lower, so that bubble is about to burst. So we're in a situation where we have unprecedented deficits in the Western world. The US budget deficit, which they're currently debating now, is called the fiscal, or the debt ceiling, is now over $1 trillion a year. And many commentators talk about unfunded liabilities of being something like $5 trillion a year. Maybe over $200 trillion in total when you think about the long-term Medicare, Medicaid, pensions, and so on and so forth. So there is a big spending problem that we have in our societies. The policy of central banks in response to this has been to reduce interest rates close to zero as far as they can, but they cannot go any further than zero. We have non-conventional policies like QE, quantitative easing, and Operation Twist, which are designed to put more liquidity back into the system, and non-conventional matters also like widespread changes to them, or we will see widespread debt defaults. Either of those is not a pleasant condition. That will obviously draw into the current environment, which is a deflationary environment where debtors will be severely penalised if we go into widespread debt default. If it's a high inflation, again, debtors will not be paid back in anything like the current parity to the money that they lent in the first place. And of course, this has an impact on the growth imperative because consumerism is a large part of the capitalist society, and there's only so much you can max out on your credit card before you yourself will be facing default. Now, if we look at the way that we are told, we can see that this is the current US headline real GDP figures since 2000. Again, not pleasant. That is recession. We know that we have in the capitalism a recession in what they call the business cycle downturn every 5 to 8 years or so. Not pleasant, but we're seeing something picking up since that time. So maybe, as the politicians are telling us, things are back on track and will look rosy. However, this is taken from a very good website. It's called Shadow Stats. It's a former government statistician, John Williams, who got thoroughly fed up with what he saw of manipulation of the statistics. As an example, changing the way that inflation is prepared. If you go back to the pre-Clinton age, you would see an inflation rate in the blue line at the top, currently running around about 9% in the US, whereas the current official numbers are talking about 2.5%. So there's quite a wide disparity. Now, anyone that is put that into context, the whole world economy, goods and services, is of the nature of about $60 trillion. So we're more than 10 times the value of all of the goods and services in the world is in this derivatives market. People say that don't worry, it's stable because you're dealing with particular counterparties. If one is a winner, then there's a loser, they all net out, and everyone is happy, and it doesn't affect me or you. But if people in your neighborhood were betting 10 times the value of all the assets and value that they have in that neighborhood in terms of those transactions, that in itself is very destabilizing. So I see that this is a problem. And the Lehman Brothers collapse brought this home because everyone understood what counterparty risk was, meaning that the banking system was highly connected in terms of this derivatives market, and thousands upon thousands of contracts affecting Lehman's then affected these other banks, and effectively the crisis meant that a large part of the banking system would have collapsed without government intervention, without government stepping in and putting forward TARP, putting forward bailouts, putting forward various provisions to prop up that banking system. And of course, this is why we have debates now about the question of whether we should separate the investment banking, the casino banking, away from the retail banking, issues about narrow banking and so on and so forth. So let's talk about how Islam deals with some of these matters. In terms of growth, growth itself is not the imperative in Islam. But I would say growth is a positive outcome out of the Islamic economy. As the Quran mentions there, in order that it does not merely circulate amongst the wealthy. So the main principle in Islam is that in terms of economy, we have certain fixed objectives. For example, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said, the son of Adam has no better right than to have food, shelter, and clothing. So there's a basic right for every human being on this planet to have food, shelter, and clothing. So the first objective in the economy is to ensure that the basic necessities, the very basic necessities, are met for all people. So poverty is a very big issue. Poverty alleviation is a very big issue. What is the point of having 5% or 8% or 10% growth in your economy if you have people starving, you have people homeless? It does not make sense. It doesn't mean that we're against growth. It doesn't mean that we're against people becoming wealthy. It is a question of actually how can your society be equitably run, because there is a phenomenal amount of wealth. And if we look at the developments that we've seen in the last 100 years, an incredible upturn in terms of technology, innovation, science. This is very positive in the world. But unfortunately, we have a financial system which is a complete disaster for the world and is putting us into this type of insecurity, not just in terms of a lack of growth, but also basic insecurity in matters like poverty, unemployment, and so on. So the Islamic economy achieves this through an encouragement of investment and spending. Gold, silver is the currency of the state and is the most stable form of currency and non-inflationary. And another very important point is that the taxation system is wealth-oriented rather than income tax and consumption tax-oriented. Not only is there a non-interest-based system, but it is coupled with anti-hoarding provisions. So obviously if one is hoarding, if one is taking wealth out of circulation, then it is going to be difficult for that wealth to be used for productive purposes, whether that is investment, whether it's spending, and so on. And of course, the last point is that company structure in Islam, Mudaraba, Mufawada, Anan, Wujud, various company structures we can talk about later in the quick question answer, deal with sharing of risk. And risk is not a dirty word in Islam, it is a good word. But it is risk within an environment in which the partners are participants and know what they are doing and know what they're taking on board. There's a nice hadith that said that Allah is a partner of the three until they cheat each other. So obviously the partners need to work within a sound regulatory framework and Sharia law. Now before I touch on some of these aspects of growth, and I want to talk a little bit more about gold and silver today, I wanted to show you this last graph, which is that the velocity of money. So that's money with zero maturity. So despite all of this mountain of debt that we have seen since we've gone off the gold standard of 71, or the former gold standard we had, and in particular since 1980, we are in this sad state of affairs because circulation of this wealth is a very critical determining factor in terms of the success of your society. Now, capitalism was built upon this notion of the free market. Markets which would be efficient in terms of the provision and utilization of capital. So the notion through the equity markets, the notion through the debt markets, was that everyone's capital requirements could be met. We are now increasingly in dysfunctional capital markets because we see government intervention on a wide scale. There's plunge protection schemes. There's actually even an act of the American law which gives the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Secretary the right to intervene into markets, and they do it very regularly. So those markets are increasingly not reflecting the reality. And on top of that, the derivatives market, which again dwarfs the real market, can also be used in a proactive manner to suppress or to boost certain asset prices. So many people concerned about the equity market of today in the US, they say that a lot of the QE has been going into this easy bumping up of the equity markets. But this type of manipulation, gold, silver market, is very small in comparison. It's not that difficult to suppress the price of gold and silver comparatively. So we are in a difficult market environment. Okay, let's talk about, and again, the paper that we submitted has 12 key distinguishing features of the Islamic economy for this question of the growth paradigm. Looking at these points, and again my colleague Sarfraz Wali this afternoon will go through a little bit more detail. Gold and silver. In Islam, there's two important usuli foundations. If I could just divert for a moment. One is that things of their nature are allowed unless prohibited. Allah in the Quran says, in translation, eat of the good things which Allah has provided for you, halal and pure, except for, then he mentions the flesh of swine, the carrion, and so on. So, matters, foodstuffs and so on, are the things which are generally allowed, but there are certain prohibitions. Actions, on the other hand, require evidence. So, before we go into transactions, before we set up a banking system, before we enter a contract for sale, purchase or sale, or any of these other matters, we need to understand in Islam what the evidence is for that. When we study the evidence for money, it's a very important matter, the Quran, the Hadith, talks exclusively in terms of gold and silver. And not only in terms of gold and silver, but some very important rules around gold and silver. Trade gold for silver, silver for gold, hand to hand, on the spot. So we have, for example, a prohibition of futures trading in gold and silver. We have a prohibition of non-physical, actual ownership of gold and silver. This is important when the price of gold and silver, my talk today is not about investment. I'm not here to sell gold and silver to you as an investment, although I might add that for the last 12 years, the price of gold has gone up every year. It's a great embarrassment to the financial markets because they've been telling everyone to put their money into equities and into the bond market. But the only thing that's gone up every year for 12 years, and by an average of 19% a year, has been the price of gold. It's the most phenomenal bull market in investment terms. That's not my point. My point is that gold and silver is money. In a sound economic environment, it is money. It is an inert metal which doesn't pay a dividend, it doesn't pay interest. It is money. It is fungible. It is easily put into coinage. It is easily storable. It doesn't tarnish. It doesn't waste away. It has industrial use. It has jewelry use. And for millennia, people have seen the value, a steady value for gold and silver. This is why it is money. And the Quran and the Sunnah have confirmed that it is money, and it is the money that we should use. Now the comparison is with fiat money, paper-based money. So if we give people, governments, the opportunity to print money, we're going to see the scenario that we have now, since 1971, whereby successive governments...
Okay, so second question.
Thank you. It's very interesting that your explanation about economic growth based on Islamic system and Sharia system. If Islamic states doesn't take advantage on that, so they are not having any much growth if compared with the other. Is there any missing link or what's the problem? Thank you.
Very good point. And again, I said at the very beginning that I'm talking in this sense, I'm talking about, in some respects, a theoretical model, although there is historical examples of the points that I've been talking about. But we have a caliphate model, or caliphate governance structure in Islam, which is the classical Islamic state. That ended in 1924, and for the previous 100 years was in a period of decline. So we had, maybe 150 years even was in a period of decline. So, but today we're in a colonial or post-colonial state whereby our economies are capitalist. And the reality is that the banking system, the global banking system, the multinational banking system dominates the banking system throughout the world and dominates the governments throughout the world. So yes, we do see some governments which have some Islamic intentions, have some application of some Islamic laws here and there, but we don't see Sharia. Sharia is not the basis of the state. Sharia is not the law applicable. And that is a very important point, because you cannot cherry pick. It's not a la carte, buffet. I'm going to take a bit of this. I like that, but I don't like this. I want to do this or do that. You need to take the whole package in Islam. I mean, I talked about gold and silver as currency. It's not going to work in interest. If we have an interest-based economy, it's not going to work with gold and silver. It cannot function. And this is one of the problems that we had with it previously, is that when they introduced interest-based, the mismatch became intolerable, because you then get a demand for money which is far more than the amount of gold and silver that you can need. So you cannot function with interest, as an example. And there are many other examples of that. The company structure in Islam is very important. The wealth tax matters, as opposed to income taxes and consumption taxes. These are very important. So you're dealing with very delicate balances between these matters, which you cannot just say, I'm going to take a bit of this and take a bit of that, and then, hey presto, we have a great functioning society. What we do have in the Muslim world is we have a very large number of what I believe is sincere Muslims. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that there are good in me and my ummah till the day of judgment, meaning that there will always be good people, but you're in an environment where, okay, you don't pay interest, and you're looking for a halal product, where to put your money. But so much in the rest of that society, we're swimming upstream. We're really fighting against what's happening. So it creates major difficulties. So the point is that we need to deal with the political as well as the economic, as well as the social aspects. You cannot just say that we're going to have some parts of Islamic economics and think that it's going to work. Having said that, because of some of the reasons which the professor mentioned earlier, a more conservative outlook generally in our societies means that many parts of the financial crisis, passed us by. But that doesn't mean that other parts of it are not there. I mean, oil and gas is a public resource in Islam. Incredibly important point. If you put that as available for multinationals, if you sell that off, if you privatize it, it's a complete and utter disaster. And that's happening throughout the world. Very sadly, it is happening throughout the world. In the Muslim world and in the Western markets. It is a complete and utter disaster. Obviously it's a big topic, but Islam doesn't allow that. So it needs to be managed on behalf of the public, on behalf of the people, not on the behalf of some multinational oil company.
Okay, maybe one more question. I just continue what Christian, atheists, and all over the world. How could you promote this economic system to them? Because you say that we cannot just take this part and leave that part. You need to take all that part. But how could you cooperate with the others, with the other economic power? I think if this economic Sharia economic system or just play independently in this work, I don't think it will survive, because we play with a very high economy. So how could you promote and cooperate or with this dynamic changing and thank you.
A very good point, and I'm glad you raised it, because it will have bilateral trade agreements. This is the way the world functions, and it functioned for hundreds of years when there was an Islamic state previously, meaning that, wherever you have a competitive advantage, maybe it's oil, it's gas, it's other things, all these matters, you will have trading agreements with other nations. It's perfectly normal. Equally, we will encourage non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, people of other faiths and so on, to live within an Islamic state, as they always did previously. The fact that if you go to Egypt today and there's a Coptic Christian community, you see many churches and these things, is a testament to the fact that Islam does not oppress other religions, and that people of other faith have a part in an Islamic society. There is what we call the law of the land in every society. So there's a law of the land, and that law of the land in an Islamic society is the Sharia law. So non-Muslims need to be respectful of that. in the same way that you would be respectful of the laws here in Germany or whereabouts you may be. So people need to be respectful of that, and there's clearly going to be differences between that. But in terms of the international stage, yes, the world will have agreements, and I think this would be very positive. I mean, the return of gold and silver as currency will have an incredibly positive impact in terms of world financial markets. I mean, some people may dispute that because obviously many governments will say, I can't print money anymore. You know, I don't have this automatic get-out clause when I've overspent my budget. I now actually have to get more real. But the governments today, they are devaluing their currencies. There's a currency war going on. You know, Venezuela just yesterday devalued its currency officially. China is unofficially devaluing its currency. It's announced to the world that they're going to be printing much more money, and indeed their currency is devaluing. There's been a war with Korea in terms of how they can devalue their currencies. It's now affecting the European Union and the US, etc. This is not right. You know, you need to be dealing on a level playing field. You need to be dealing with real assets and real values. This is what trade is all about, and this is where gold and silver ultimately is just a medium of exchange. It provides a degree of stability in terms of your trade. But we will expect to see any Islamic society to be active in the world community as a trade partner, cultural matters, dawah matters. All of these things are important moving forward.
Okay, thank you very much.